Any field that stands up and dares to challenge that consensus gets a shed load of abuse for doing it. So as you all look to your careers after you've left this place, I promise you that if you decide to challenge orthodoxy in any walk of your life, you are in for one hell of a hard fight. But I'm either very gifted, or I'm just very stupid, or perhaps a bit of both. But it didn't bother me. It didn't worry me from the start that what I believed was mocked, laughed at, ridiculed, and then as we grew in numbers, painted out to be the most dangerous thing that faced Western civilization. You know, consensuses are often wrong. Go back through history, look at scientific consensuses that prove to be nonsense. Look at economic consensuses that prove to be wrong. Perhaps the exchange rate mechanism in Britain's case being a very good one. And look at political consensuses. Look at the way we in the West, all through the 1930s, appeased Nazi Germany, believing that it wasn't quite as bad as that nasty Mr. Churchill said, believing that actually we could tame these people. All through the history of mankind, you will find consensuses can be wrong. And I would put this to you, that what happened in 2016, and 2016 is a year that people will read about in 100 or 200 years' time. 2016, I think, marks the pivot for a completely new political order. Now, there were some who describe themselves generally as being on the left that choose to stamp their feet, that choose to protest, that choose to accept there can be an alternative argument to the one that they believe to be true, who condemn and attack anybody who believes in border controls as xenophobes, racists or worse. It's got so bad that in universities all over the West, we've now started to no platform people because we don't like their opinions. And this, folks, poses a real, ever-present threat and danger to freedom of speech, to freedom of thinking, to freedom of association, and indeed, actually, to the whole democratic process itself. The next time someone says to you, we must not have this speaker because we think they're homophobic or transphobic or they're global warming deniers or whatever, this idea that if you close down the debate and don't allow people to speak, that somehow they'll just go away, isn't necessarily true. And let me give you one example of why actually you and all universities should offer an open platform and listen respectfully, even to arguments that you fundamentally disagree with, because actually, sometimes, by putting a bit of sunshine onto something, that can be the ultimate disinfectant against really bad people with really bad views. We had a debate in the United Kingdom about a guy 10 years ago called Nick Griffin. Nick Griffin led the British National Party, all right? The British National Party was an openly, avowedly racist organisation. It was there in Articles 2 and 3 of their constitution. There was much talk about banning them, not letting them stand. But that, of course, would have been literally impossible in a democracy. But once Griffin became an MEP, the big debate was, we must keep this man off the airwaves. We must not allow his vile, poisonous rhetoric to reach out to the minds and eyes and ears of our country. And a massive debate, should Nick Griffin appear on Question Time? You know, the UK's biggest weekly debate show. There were those on the left saying that if he appeared, you know, he'd sweep the country, he'd be Prime Minister within 5 years. People like Peter Hain, that he must be banned. And people like me saying, do you know what? The best thing you can do is to put Griffin on Question Time. When he was put on Question Time, he was completely and utterly bloody hopeless. He could barely string a sentence together. I don't know about some big personality on the right of politics. He was more like a blancmange. And the arguments that he put were so irrational and so clearly based on complete hatred and distaste of others that it was the end of Griffin and it was the end of the British National Party. So I would urge in universities, throughout the media, that we make sure we give the Nick Griffins of this world a platform, because that is the way actually to sink them and finish them off. And I'm going to be going in April. I've got a week's tour of American universities, and I'm going to need a much bigger security presence than I've had today here in Dublin. But I'm going to go out there and do it, and I'm going to make those same arguments to that audience there as I've made to you today. And I do please want the younger generation to open their minds up to the fact that other people have different point of views. Most of the opposing views will be respectable, but even those that are not have to be heard in an open, free society so that they can be dismantled. Now I go back to 2016. Brexit. I mean, amazing, isn't it? Every single world leader told us that we'd go into poverty, the stock market would collapse, our properties would collapse, nobody would invest in the country. They didn't go quite as far, but they almost told us a plague of black locusts would descend on the country and all would be laid to waste. We even had the American president, Obama, coming over telling us we'd be at the back of the queue. But despite all of it, Brexit happened. And then, if the established liberal global order hadn't had a bad enough year with Brexit, along came this guy who's made a few quid in real estate, who had not been classically educated, who spoke and behaved in a way that most in Washington thought was like a down-market lorry driver, and he shocked and stunned the establishment by winning. So Brexit and Trump all happened in 1 year. The question is, were they, as Mr. Blair thinks, and Mr. Macron thinks, and Mrs. Merkel thinks, were they just short-term blips, short-term outpourings of anger, as Mr. Blair sees it, from those who are not as clever as him and probably don't wash as often as him? I mean, the way the establishment talks down to the Brexit voter or the Trump voter, you have to see it simply to believe it. So were they short-term outpourings of anger, and are we going to go back to the globalist order? The order where Goldman Sachs and Siemens Engineering and Unilever basically own the political class. I'm always fascinated how anybody on the left of politics can ever support the European Union project when it is so clearly bought and paid for by big investment banks and giant multinationals. Are we going to go back to that or not? Well, I would put this to you. When those books are written 100 years from now, what they will say is that 2016 was the year when people said, we want to live in nation states. We are no longer going to be told that we should be ashamed of our flag, ashamed of being patriotic, ashamed of our identity, ashamed of the concept that it's right in life to put your family or your country or your own people first. We will no longer sign up to this big globalist order. And I honestly think if you look around, what's happening now in Europe, Catalonia, and unbelievable. Despite everything, that new parliament now has a majority for separation from Spain. They may not carry it out, but how interesting. They don't want just to separate from Spain, do they? They want to separate from the European Union as well. We have governments now in Poland, governments in Hungary, governments in Slovakia, governments in the Czech Republic. In fact, Andrew Marr on the BBC a couple of months back said, he said, if you listen to the language that is being used for the prime ministers of those four countries, they make Nigel Farage sound like a Foreign Office diplomat. I mean, something big is changing out there. Viktor Orban in Hungary says, you know, we didn't escape communism 30 years ago to live back in a system where unelected bureaucrats tell us what we can and can't do, and where foreign courts can overrule ours. So there is a massive debate on the future of Europe going on everywhere. I was in Vienna earlier this week. Vienna, Austria, now a country pretty much as Eurosceptic as the United Kingdom is. So where's Brexit going from here? Well, we have one problem with Brexit. Well, we've got more than one problem. We've got one really big problem with Brexit, and she's called Theresa May, who I think is the worst Prime Minister I've ever seen in my lifetime. And I tell you what, that's quite takes some doing. We've had some problems. No, she's really bad, she doesn't believe in it, and we've picked this fork in the road, and she's trying to straddle both positions. She's trying to keep together a warring Tory party who've had problems with this issue for over 40 years. So we are limping towards Brexit very, very slowly. My guess is that Brexit will happen. We will leave the European Union, though I suspect not on the terms that I would have liked. But I'm also beginning to think that it'll be on terms that Ireland won't like. Because the one country that gets the most affected by Brexit after the United Kingdom is the Republic of Ireland. Logic says, pure logic says, that Monsieur Barnier and the negotiating team in Brussels should want to have a rounded trade deal with the United Kingdom. Why? Well, it's easy actually, because they sell us 80 billion euros worth of goods every year, more than we sell them. Whether it's German cars, whether it's French wine, whether it's Belgian chocolate, or indeed Irish beef, we are a very, very big net buyer from the EU. But for Barnier and Brussels, this renegotiation is more about them being seen to punish the United Kingdom for wanting to leave that political union than it is to apply common logic. I don't believe the European Commission in this is representing the interests of the member states, the interests of European companies, or the interests of European workers. They are representing the European project because they know if Britain is seen to leave and to have a good deal, it's the end of the Union. Even in Ireland, well, there's been so little debate on this subject. Over 40% of Irish people said if the UK left successfully, we would like Ireland to leave too. And certainly in Denmark, certainly in Austria, and I think increasingly in Hungary and Poland, the same would happen. How does a return to tariffs affect us in the United Kingdom? It makes life more difficult. But hey, there's a big world out there. But a move to non-tariff trade with no specific deal on agriculture is potentially very bad news for Ireland. Why? Nearly 50% of Irish exports from Irish-owned companies go to the United Kingdom. And in sectors like beef, it's perhaps as much as 80% of Irish beef production that is sold into the UK market. I can assure you that every single person on the Brexit campaign, and this includes the DUP in Northern Ireland, wants us to go on having a good trade relationship with each other. Every single person in the Brexit process is opposed to the return of any form of hard border between the North and the South. Every single person on the Brexit side of the argument recognises and cheers and applauds the fact that relations between our two countries have improved so amazingly over the course of the last 25 years, and we don't want that squandered. But I do have to ask a question about the Taoiseach and quite where his priorities lie. Now, don't misunderstand me. He's a very charming man. I had a drink with him in Strasbourg the other week. You see, what I said earlier, in a democracy, you need to respect and talk to somebody, even though you've got a different point of view. We had a drink together. I have to say, he's a very good operator. He's a real smoothie. He's a bit like the Irish Blair, really. And that's a compliment. No, he's a good operator. But it seems to me that in these negotiations, he's taking the Brussels side of this against Britain and not the one that is in the most interests of this country. And I think, I really do mean that. I think what we should do, I think Britain and Ireland should go next month to Brussels and to say, look, even if there is not to be a trade deal between the European Union and the United Kingdom, an exception must be made for the Republic of Ireland and the UK. Those two countries need to continue with this free trade relationship, not just for Irish beef or for British insurance services, but actually because of the political sensitivity of things on this island that are so very much better than they were 20 years ago, and we want to do our utmost to make sure that stays in place. And I know that in doing this, we would have the support of the World Trade Organization. I know in doing this, we would find strong support from the White House and many other places. And that is something that I'm going to argue and fight for in the European Parliament over the course of the next few months. Although it's perhaps fair to say that not always are my speeches in the European Parliament taken up, endorsed, approved and put into action, but it's certainly something that the Irish Taoiseach should be arguing for. I don't know what happens if this goes wrong. It'll be bad for Irish agriculture in the short term. I guess we'll have to find a way through it in the medium term. But what I do know, folks, is all over Europe there is a big debate going on about its future. Because the lesson from Brexit that the European Commission drew was not, let's learn from this and hand powers back to member states. No, the opposite. They're building a fully, well, I was going to say federalised, but actually a fully unitary United States of Europe. It will, by 2025, have its own army, its own air force, its own navy. They want a foreign policy without any individual veto rights, which would mean that no member would be able to veto acts such as going to war. They want to make sure that every country has to join the Euro, has to join the Schengen area, and they want to appoint a finance minister with the ability to interfere in member states' economies above and beyond that of their own governments. Now look, if you are a proponent and a supporter of a United States of Europe, if you think that nation-state democracy and national identity, frankly, should be thrown on the scrap heap of history, I would say to you, I think you're wrong, but I respect your right to hold that point of view. What I don't respect are national politicians pretending you can stay inside this European Union and not effectively become a province of that new United States of Europe. And I don't think that in Ireland you've had that honesty of debate so far. I think it's very important that you do. I'll be suggesting that maybe Ireland needs to have this debate and have a rethink about its future. As I say, ultimately, I want people to have an honest choice. And the choice that you will face, because this referendum will come here at some point in time, the choice that we face is, do we want to be an independent, self-governing, democratic nation-state or part of a bigger political union? And do you know what? We chose Brexit, which after 25 years of campaigning for, all I can say is thank God.
Thank you very much, Nigel, for your stimulating and thoughtful address. The way this is going to work is that I'm going to start by asking Nigel one or two questions. We'll then throw the proceedings open to the floor. I'll ask you to raise your hand and indicate that you want to ask a question. If I call on you, you can stand up, tell us who you are, and address your question to Nigel. I will have to be relatively ruthless with the length of your contributions. If you want to make a point, make it brief and to the point, or else I'll have to ask you to bring your question to a close. I'm not a particularly big fella. I won't be able to throw you out myself, but we've got a range of we have a range of Hist heavies. If that's not a contradiction in terms. Who will enforce the will of the chair? Peace be upon it. Nigel, how do you think the whole Brexit lark is going at the moment? And where do you think it's going? Because from over here, it seems that the British government is conceding on every major point in the negotiations. Your economy has gone from the fastest growing in Europe to the slowest growing in Europe, and you haven't even left yet. And I was intrigued that there appeared to be, I may be misinterpreting this, but there appeared to be a note of doubt in your address when you said you thought Britain would end up leaving. Is there a doubt there that it
Well, the doubt isn't about Brexit. Brexit is the best opportunity we've been presented for decades. It's the chance to break free of a bureaucratic club that overregulates our businesses, that acts in the interest of the multinationals and not the 5.2 million men and women running small and medium-sized enterprises, sole traders, all that kind of thing. It's a chance for us to deregulate, to go global, in fact, to do some of the things that Ireland did back in the early 1990s with such amazing effect, when you cut corporation tax as an example. So it's not Brexit that's going wrong, it's the fact the government that's implementing Brexit doesn't really believe in it. And I agree with you. You know, the European Commission say jump, and Theresa May says how high. And we concede on money, we concede on the power of foreign courts. There's even talk of regulatory alignment, which frankly would take away the biggest advantage that Brexit potentially has for us. My fear is that there's a game going on, all right? Barnier will not give us a good deal, in return for which the House of Commons would reject the deal. What's the timeline on this? Well, things can always slip, of course, in politics, but at the moment, the trade deal has to be concluded by October. The ratification has to take place by next March. So if we get a rejection of that deal in the House of Commons this time next year, there is going to be a crisis. What is going to happen? And my biggest fear, I hope I'm wrong, because I mean, don't forget, you know, in terms of political honesty, both the Labour and Conservatives, in their manifestos in June, both said Britain will leave the European Union, leave the single market, and take back control of her borders. So it would be an absolute, outright act of total political dishonesty, but I wouldn't put it past them.
So do you think there is a real chance that Brexit does not happen?
I think there's a real chance that we may have to fight this all over again.
In a second referendum?
I've seen the crookery of the European project. They made Ireland vote. Well, twice. The Irish had to vote again.
No. Ireland decided to vote.
I was there. I was in Strasbourg the day after the Irish vote, and the Irish were told to vote again. So stop pretending. If you want a United States of Europe, that's fine. But stop pretending that Ireland makes these decisions. She doesn't. She's part of a bigger European project.
Ireland makes these decisions.
In fact, the Irish budget 4 years ago was presented to the German government before the Irish Parliament. I mean, if that's not... I got you on that one, didn't I?
Let me pick you up on one small point that you did make that you made in your first answer when you talked of the EU being under the influence of multinationals. But how do countries, especially small countries, stand up to multinationals that may be bigger and richer and more powerful than them? Surely it's only, as you see with the action against Apple and against Google, surely it's only international bodies, whether they be the EU or the OECD, that can stand up to multinationals.
Well, the action against Apple showed the impotence of Ireland as a country, didn't it? Because a foreign court made a decision which, once again, the Irish government had to comply with. Look,
the European Commission made a ruling which the Irish government decided to appeal as a sovereign act of the Irish government.
Yes.
It's not a foreign court. It's a court.
What is it?
Even though it wasn't.
What is it?
Even though it wasn't the court. The
what
court that you refer to, the ECJ, is a court to which Ireland and the UK have freely subscribed to allow to adjudicate disputes over European law and only European law.
The fact that our political class have surrendered our sovereignty is beyond doubt.
But how many referendums have we had in this country that have decided to cede certain parts of our sovereignty or to pool certain parts of our sovereignty to advance our national interests in the EU?
Look, it's like you're either pregnant, pregnant or you're not. You're either pregnant or you're not. You're either sovereign or you're
not. That's
not
a debate I get into this.
Within months, you'll be discussing the very same thing, won't you? No, honestly, stop the pretense. Either you want a United States of Europe and Ireland to be a province of it, and that is an honest intellectual position. Stop pretending you can be sovereign and a member of the European Union. You can't.
But isn't the big pretense that Brussels is forcing us to do all these things we don't want to do, when in fact the only laws that Brussels can make, or the only regulations that Brussels can enforce, are in those areas that every single country has decided it wants to, in accordance with its own democratic procedures and traditions, that it has decided to pool.
Look, the basis of lawmaking and the basis of democracy is that you can, through your vote, in an election, change not just the people that make your laws, but the laws by which you live. You know, elections have been fought for all time on this law being changed or that law being changed. Under the European system of lawmaking, the people with the sole right to propose legislation are the unelected European Commission bureaucracy. The sole people with the ability to propose the repeal of legislation are the unelected European Commission bureaucracy. And if every voter in Ireland voted, for your parliament, and every single member of parliament wanted to change a European law, you can't do it. And the European Parliament can't do it. And the point I'm making to you is, however inefficient democracy may be seen to be, because a government might go that way for a few years and the next one goes the other way, I understand the points about efficiency, but if you believe in a democratic lawmaking system and accountability, then this European Union, as it's constructed today, is an abomination. Now look, I am not anti-European in any way at all. I've worked for European companies. I love Europe as a place. I think its richness, its cultural diversity makes it the most interesting part of the world to be part of and to travel in. But I want a Europe where genuinely sovereign states sit round the table and agree to do things that are in their mutual interest. Not a Europe where previously sovereign states give away the ability to govern their lives.
I don't want to make this a ding-dong between you and me because
Well,
I want to bring in the audience. So I'll ask you one more question, specifically with relation to Ireland. What do you think is going to happen to the border? What should happen to the border?
Well, the idea that we have a seamless border now, and there's no difference between the north and south, is of course nonsense, isn't it? You've already got a different currency in the south and the north. You've got different tax rates in the south and the north. And as you fully well know, according to whether the pound is weak or strong, shoppers flee one side of the border or the other to different supermarkets to take advantage of that. So there are already significant differences on that border. If we do go to a customs regime, we will have to have number plate recognition technology in place. We will. It's as simple as that. Exactly where we cite it is a matter of debate. I want the UK and Ireland, as I think pleaded for in my speech, I want the UK and Ireland to have a tariff-free deal so we will not need to have even number plate recognition. And the only potential threat would be if Ireland is forced to join the Schengen area, and if Ireland then becomes seen possibly to be a route for illegal immigration into the United Kingdom. But I don't see that happening, frankly, in the course of the next few years. So I just think common sense and pragmatism, the only person that wants a hard border is Michel Barnier. The only person I've heard argue for a hard border is the European Commission, because they're putting it up as yet another difficult stumbling block. I don't believe it's that.
I want to open it to the floor. Gentleman down here.
Thank you for coming, Nigel. I'm a proponent of free speech myself, so it's great to have you here. Just about the future of Europe. You have in the East the AFD, even movements like Pegida and Orbán. How is that going to work with Merkel and Macron if they continue to go along the line of the United States Europe? And how did the pundits in 2015 get it so wrong about this rise of nationalism?
Yeah, well, let's do the last bit first. If you put a £1, right, accumulator on the 1st of January 2016 on Brexit, Trump and Leicester City for the Premier League, it would have made you 20 million quid. A £1 accumulator on those three would have made you 20 million quid. So I think we're living in an age where these predictions are ridiculous. We're living in an age where polling in some ways isn't working because people just don't tell pollsters the truth. The kind of voter that is so hacked off with career politics, actually, when they get a phone call from the pollster, they put the pollster in the same class as the politicians they hate and the media they hate. And they say something off and put the phone down. So they're finding it very difficult to measure a lot of these voters. Look, the AFD in Germany basically has upset the electoral arithmetic in that country. It is the first Eurosceptic voice we've seen in German politics. Look, there are others in Greece. I mean, Varoufakis. I know he sort of wanders around universities now and he's rather entertaining and good fun. I mean, that was a left-wing rebellion. So this is not purely on the right. There are parties of the right, centre and left who are questioning why are we, as a country, not able to make the basic decisions that 200 other countries in the world make for themselves. And I, honestly, the European Union is going for a full political state. They want it completed by 2025. They couldn't be clearer. And what I see in virtually every country in the European Union, apart from Ireland at the moment, where there is no organised party against the European project, but what I see are the growth of those parties everywhere. And what history tells me is that no free people ever willingly give up the right to govern themselves. And those countries in the East, they've lived under Nazism, they've lived under communism, They've enjoyed these democracies for a very brief period of time. And the day that switch goes and they start to see Brussels in a similar light to the old Soviet Union, they'll be gone. I genuinely do not think the European project will be there in 10 to 15 years' time. I hope that it's going, happens peacefully. I hope it happens democratically. And we can then move on to the kind of Europe that I talked about earlier. A Europe of nations, and do you know what? We will agree to work on cross-border pollution. We will agree to work on cross-border crime and trafficking of people. We will agree, actually, on sensible common minimum standards. There's a lot of stuff we can do together as friends and neighbours, but we don't need to give the ability to be the masters of our own destiny to the European Commission.
Lady over the side, sit down, you're next.
Hi, you spoke a lot about the democratic process and Brexit being the will of the British people. So of the 52% of people in England, or Britain rather, that voted for Brexit, how many of them do you think were influenced by incorrect claims made by your party and your side that the 350 million pounds that were sent to the EU were going to the NHS?
Well, you're quite right to talk about lies. Over 50 years of them. Over 50 years of them. Do you know, my parents voted in a referendum in 1975 and they were told by the three party leaders, this is just about free trade. This will never affect your sovereignty. And yet we knew all along the plan was to transfer most of our law-making decisions somewhere else. The scale of lies that have been told have been truly incredible, as indeed they were in the Lisbon II referendum in this country. And yet, the establishment, and obviously there's applause in the room, a lot of Goldman Sachs supporters here in the room. You really are amazing. Quite amazing how universities support multinationals.
But
what a crush democracy.
350 million.
And had they said 220, had Boris said 220 million a week, it would have been factually accurate, totally accurate, and it still would have been a figure at which people would have said, wow. I begged him and Gove not to use 350, because whilst it's not a lie, because we have to account for it in our figures every year, it would have always been more sensible to use the net figure. But you know something? If that's all the establishment can drag up as an accusation, I think they're in some trouble with the argument about who lied the most. Because they told us there'd be an emergency budget. We were told we'd be at the back of the queue. We were told millions of people would lose their jobs. A slight inaccuracy on numbers is nothing compared to that.
Bespoke deal. Are there any existing models, Switzerland, Norway, Canada, or Turkey, that you would be satisfied with for Britain in the long term?
Not really, no. Switzerland has a model that kind of suits her. Norway has a model that suits her, and of course Norway, unlike Ireland, has her own fishing rights. Interesting to think, all these blue and gold signs you see all over this country, funded by the European Union, part funded by the European Union. Actually, what Ireland has lost in fish value to the European Union is way more than all the money that's ever come into this country. So Norway's got a deal that suits it. Switzerland's got a deal that suits it. Canada has got a deal on goods, but not one on services. It is logical for a country the size of the United Kingdom, and for a country with whom about 5.5 million workers across the EU rely quite heavily on their labour and their goods being sold to. It was the most obvious thing in the world. Any businessman or woman you spoke to would say, do you know what? We can negotiate this in 2 hours and then go for a good lunch. Because it's so obvious that to make life easy for everybody, we simply continue with the trade arrangements we've got. I'm afraid we're up against bloody-mindedness. We're up against very, very extreme nationalists, EU nationalists, who will stop at nothing to build their United States of Europe, and they are making political decisions and not economic decisions. And I'm sorry about that. I would rather that this separation was quick and smooth, but they don't want it. So I think on March the 22nd, 3rd is the next big European Leaders Summit. That's when trade will be on the table. That is when Mrs May has a real problem. And I've always argued, no deal is better than a bad deal, and I will go on making that case.
Do you think she should walk out?
I don't think she'll be there on March the 22nd. You know,
She got something on.
I think she should go into hiding, frankly. You know, will she make it that far? You know, the way that it works in the Conservative Party, if 48 backbench MPs, that's 15% of the parliamentary party, put a letter in saying they've lost confidence in the leader and they want a contest, then there has to be a contest. Now, none of us quite know the truth of this, and Westminster, you know, is very, very good at the rumour mill. But I spoke to quite a senior Tory MP yesterday. He said, well, there's certainly well over 40 letters have been registered. So I think there is going to be, before the summer, there's going to be a leadership contest in the Tory party. I'll put my neck on the line and say that. I really think it will happen. Who'll win it? Well, it'll be probably between Boris and between Amber Rudd. Well, it'll be between Boris and Amber Rudd, and that's what the bookmakers say right now. But coming up on the rails, there is an old Etonian called Jacob Rees-Mogg. It's very interesting. Voters like authenticity. And Jacob does not pretend to be other exactly than he is.
That's a nice way of putting it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, it is pretty eccentric stuff, but he's absolutely clear in what he believes in on every single, whether it's a moral issue or a political issue. You know where Jacob stands. I would say this. If Jacob made... So the MPs select down to 2. So half a dozen stand, typically. It gets down to a short list of 2. Then the Conservative members in the country choose. If Jacob made the last 2, he would win. So that would be a very fundamental change.
Even against Boris?
Yes.
What a lineup.
Yes. Yes.
Gentlemen, down the back.
Mr. Farage, do you think that Ireland needs a Eurosceptic political party? And if one was to form, would you be willing to campaign on its behalf?
Do you know, it's amazing. When I came to Dublin in the Lisbon 2, because your first result was wrong, you idiotic, stupid people, and you must vote again. When I came for Lisbon 2, do you know, I shared a platform with Mary Lou McDonald. And whatever political differences I might have had with Sinn Féin in the past, it seemed to be this question of the European Union and national democracy was bigger than that, so I shared a platform with her. And in those days, Sinn Féin was a true nationalist party, not only opposed to the North being part of the United Kingdom, but opposed to the island of Ireland being part of the European Union. It was a rational, logical position for a nationalist party to take. And they've completely done a 180-degree turn on this. Now, I'm sure this has absolutely nothing to do with the hundreds of thousands of euros every single year that are coming in the direction of Sinn Féin representatives from the European Union. I'm sure there's no link whatsoever, and I say that because I'm really getting bored with being sued by people.
In fairness, UKIP gets a rather lot of money from the European Parliament.
UKIP only succeeded because of it. Yes, UKIP couldn't have succeeded without it. Of course, we took the devil's money to do God's work, no question about that. So Sinn Féin, which was the Eurosceptic party in Ireland, and, you know, has effectively disappeared as a Eurosceptic party. There are who knows how many, but there are an appreciable number of Irish people deeply unhappy about what's happened to Irish independence, very worried about what a full European army means for Irish neutrality, desperate to get back 200 miles of the Atlantic, which now has in it a tuna fishery we didn't even know was there 40 years ago. So these people deserve, in 15 months' time, in the European Parliament, to have some representation. And if a party came along in Ireland that was made up of sensible, non-extreme people who just believed in national democracy, if they asked me for my help, if they thought I'd be helpful to them, then the answer is yes.
Okay, we have time for a few more questions.
Sure. I'll be quicker. I'll be quicker.
Yeah. So, gentleman over here.
Yes, I was just wondering, what do you think of the prospect of United Ireland?
You promised to be quick.
Talk about spoiling a good party. It's not going to happen anytime soon. We look into the future, demographic change, we could be in a very different position. But it's not really, to be honest with you, it's interesting, isn't it? Even in the north, Sinn Féin don't campaign on this in quite the same way they used to. And all I would say quickly is whatever sacrifices had to be made for that peace process, things are a bloody sight better than they were 20 years ago, and that's what matters.
Do you think that Brexit could bring a united Ireland closer?
No, I don't. I think Brexit may well bring Ireland out of the European Union. That's more likely, in a sense, than Brexit breaking up the UK. I don't see that.
Okay.
What do you think motivates the no platforming movement that we're seeing across universities and we've experienced ourselves in organising this event?
It's a form of extreme political correctness. It's a form of the assertion that a certain group of people are morally better than people that have other points of view. And it is remarkable to see people who are basically mainstream conservatives being called homophobes, racists, extremists. So I think it is this kind of, the left has now taken up this position of virtue. They believe that they have the right answer. I also worry, and I can't speak for Ireland, but I can speak for the UK, I worry that we're not teaching critical thinking in our schools. We're tending to teach people through the syllabus that we have, this is right, everything else is wrong. And actually, from the age of 14 or 15, we all need to be taught there are two perfectly reasonable answers to this question, and you make your own mind up. But it is a disturbing development, and as I said to you, all of us that believe in free speech and democracy must fight damned hard against it. It's really important.
Gentleman here in the hoodie.
I have a hoodie. That was the camera.
Hello, Nigel.
Hi.
If you've talked about parties like the AfD in Germany and the far-right ones in Austria, given the contesting of people like Marine Le Pen and Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, which far-right movement do you think is the most likely in Western Europe to sort of get into government?
Well, it depends what you call far right, doesn't it? I mean, clearly, the Freedom Party in Austria are a pretty hard right party. They're now in coalition government. When they went into coalition government in 2001, the European Union were going to put sanctions on Austria. They go into government now, they take big jobs like defence and foreign affairs, and nobody utters a dicky bird. It shows you just how far politics in Europe has shifted. The French National Front under Marine Le Pen was never going to win because there were too many genuine anti-Semitic associations going back all the way, really, to the early 1950s. Tough to tell which one will break through and do it. All I would say is that in countries like Denmark, now Euroscepticism is so mainstream that if Britain left the EU successfully, Denmark would follow almost immediately. So there is a big shift. Tough to tell where the next big one is, but really the most powerful Eurosceptic in Europe now is Viktor Orban in Hungary. And that, I think, is where the great clash between the European Union and a national prime minister at some point in the next 18 months is going to come.
Okay, lady in green here in the middle.
Hi. So young people, generally as a cohort, both in Ireland and across the EU, tend to be overwhelmingly liberal and overwhelmingly pro-EU in most cases. What do you think that spells as they, grow up and continue voting and shaping political movements for the future of what you call a long-term political movement of populism that started in 2016?
This is a really interesting debate. I mean, this is actually, I promise to be short, this is actually worthy of a debate. Because what you've said may be true in the UK, may be true in Ireland, it's not true in France. It's not true in Austria. It's not true in Italy. Do you know, Beppe Grillo's five-star movement, which leads the polls there, virtually has no voters over the age of 40. Marine Le Pen topped the poll among young voters. Syriza in Greece topped the poll among young voters, and the Freedom Party in Austria topped the poll among young voters. Those that want to leave the euro and leave the European Union, on mainland Europe, it's the youth supporting this. And I think it's because so many of them have seen the disastrous damage the euro has done to their country. You know, the euro is a German-dominated currency that has benefited Germany and done a lot of harm to a load more people. So this youth thing, yeah, you're half right, you're half wrong. It depends what part of Europe you go to.
Okay, I'm going to take two more questions.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, we're gentlemen down here.
They are such complicated questions that need long answers.
I know, well, we're in Trinity.
Absolutely.
Hi there. My question is, like, you're talking about countries and their sovereignty and democratic rights. Do you not think now in the UK there are countries like Scotland, Northern Ireland, who have seen their vote in the UK being overridden by the mandate of the English and Welsh people, who are looking towards London the same way you look towards Brussels, and they're seeing an English-dominant union where you see a German union overriding? And should we question our rights to be in the UK?
Do you know? You go beyond the M25. The rest of England looks at London as a foreign country. So, you know, no, I mean, look, the Scottish thing's over. It's done. It's finished. This great myth, this complete falsitude that the SNP sold, we can be independent and in the European Union. And people have seen through that, because you can't be both. I mean, Nicola Sturgeon opposes the result of the Scottish referendum and the EU referendum. There isn't much she agrees with really these days, is there? No, I do understand your point. Actually, in many ways, holding the United Kingdom together is difficult enough, let alone a Europe with a Protestant north and a Catholic south. I mean, it's just never going to work. We've got stresses and strains within the United Kingdom. We've always had those stresses and strains. I don't think they're any worse as a result of Brexit than they were before, is my view.
Okay, last question, gentleman over here. Yep, no, not you, right behind you. Sorry.
You ruined his day!
All right, we'll take you, sir. We'll take two questions.
Nigel, what do you think split Brexit so firmly between ideological lines? Why do you think the left almost entirely would vote to remain and the right were more in favour of leaving? What split it so firmly between?
Just not true. Just not true. It may well be Euro fanatics, and that became the new thing they believed in. However, the left in the United Kingdom, there is still a strong Eurosceptic voice amongst the left in England, Wales and Scotland, but you don't see it in Parliament. You see it amongst the voters. 35 to 40% of people who voted Labour in June 17 had voted Brexit the year before. So all you read about are Tory splits on Europe. Actually, there's a big rift in the Labour Party. And when I was leading UKIP and going through the days when I was picking up a few million votes, I was actually hurting the Labour Party more than I was hurting the Conservative Party. Indeed, Cameron would not have got a majority if it hadn't been for that UKIP vote. So Europe actually, or whether we're a self-governing nation or not, splits the left and it splits the right, which means really, British politics is all a nonsense. What they ought to do in the Commons is, right, okay, Those of you that like Europe, sit over there. Those that hate it, sit over there, and we'll start again.
And we will take this guy here. How could you refuse that pleading That'd be a good question now.
About your opposition you feel in the mainstream media and speaking in colleges. Would you not believe that could be more to do with the fact that you got 52% to vote for Brexit because of appealing to different sentiments than one today? You mentioned sovereignty and overruling courts, but in the lead up to the Brexit referendum, you mentioned there was buses with 350 million and there was accusations of fear of illegal immigration, people taking their jobs. And people believe that there's a contradiction in what you say here and what you got.
No, I absolutely reject that. I spoke earlier about how for 60 years we'd run a sane immigration system. We threw it out of the window when 8, then 10 former communist countries joined the European Union, and that's a debate that will be had in Ireland too. Just to completely get rid of any border controls makes no sense at all, and an overwhelming majority of people want an Australian-style point system. Look, the 350 million a week, I'll say to both of you, it wasn't me, all right? It was Boris, and I promise you not to let me.
We're up against time, but I'm going to ask him one more question. You get to do that when you're in the chair. Do you ever wonder, or do you ever worry yourself that all this talk of nationalism and the nation states and immigration and all that comes with it, and all the paraphernalia, the advertising that was used and all that in the campaign and what stands behind that, do you ever worry that that could lead us somewhere very nasty indeed? And about your own responsibility for that?
Yeah, I've done more than any politician in the United Kingdom since 1945 to destroy the far right in Britain by saying to all the people who were voting National Front or BNP, if you're voting for these parties because you are absolutely hacked off with what is happening to your lives, what is happening to your wages, but you don't subscribe to the extreme racist agenda, the nasty stuff that these parties stand for, then come and vote for me. And do you know what? They did. They did. And because of that, we destroyed those political parties and we made UKIP a respectable political party, who, even though those didn't like it, through abuse of it, now virtually everything that UKIP campaigned for and was initially abused for was in the manifestos of the Labour and Conservative parties last time round. So no, I don't. But what I do fear is a European project that goes deeper, that goes further, that removes yet more power from voters over their lives. That may well then lead to very extreme nationalisms. Maybe that's why the third biggest party in Greece today is called Golden Dawn, a party that is proud to call itself neo-Nazi. I fear that a project that takes away from people the most powerful thing they possess in a free society, namely their ability to be the judges and to determine their own future, if you take that away from people, then all they're left with is violence and extremism. And I do fear the ultimate backlash to the European project could be that, which is why I want it broken up. It's why I want a Europe of genuine democratic nation states, because if they are democratic, they will never go to war with each other and will trade with each other and will have a Europe with far less resentments than the resentments this European Union is breeding in people today.